Welcome, good afternoon. We're really delighted that you've been able to join us for today's roundtable, Building Recovery, the Scale of Challenge and Opportunity. This is one of the events in Future of London's major programme for this year, Building Recovery. And through this programme, we're going to be looking at how we can use recovery to create fairer urban environments. The whole programme is possible thanks to our brilliant sponsors, Arup, Countryside, Lewis Silkin, Montague Evans, Mount Anvil, and Pollard Thomas Edwards Architects. We've got a large panel today, so that I'd recommend you switch to speaker view, which will just make it a bit easier for you to be able to focus on whoever is speaking. We like to try and make the event as interactive as we possibly can, so if you can all change your screen names so that we can see who you are and where you're from, that's really brilliant. We love to know who you all are. If you can pop yourselves on mute for now, that's really helpful too. I encourage you really to use the chat to add any thoughts or reflections or perhaps any resources that you think might be useful to the rest of the network. So please say hi, and you can always private message people if there's anybody you want to sort of connect with directly. If at any point you want to add a question to the panel, you can do that in the chat and we'll pick those up later in the Q&A section. When we do get to the Q&A section, if you are happy to come on screen and ask your question in person, that's really great. But equally, if you're more comfortable to ask it on chat, that's fine. You can raise your hand as well, and we can come to you if you want to ask your question in person. You can follow tweets to this event and others in the programme using our hashtag #ClosingTheGap. So for anybody who's just kind of joining, welcome, great to have you here, and if you can just pop yourself on mute, that would be fab. So today's going to be quite fast-paced, and I'm really excited to have such a wonderful mixed and interesting panel alongside me. The aim for today is really to try and highlight the key challenges we're all facing when it comes to achieving fairer cities. We want to try and understand these shared issues that we have, whether you work in the public, private or not-for-profit sector, and regardless of your specialism. So we're going to be covering themes around housing, public space, transport, culture, arts and skills. So it is deliberately broad, but we hope will help us prioritise some of these shared issues that we need to find joint solutions for. We're going to start with 3 opening statements about some common issues that we've uncovered in our research so far. And then our broader panel is going to respond, giving us an idea of the issues they're facing, as well as a nod to some effective approaches to overcome these barriers. There'll be a chance for your questions, as I've mentioned at the end, and anything that we discuss is really going to help us to shape the remainder of the programme and the best practice that we really need to kind of highlight for you, or to give you the kind of tactics and the inspiration that you need. After the main event, we're going to have 3 rooms for networking. We know lots of you are missing kind of getting together over drinks and nibbles, and whilst unfortunately we can't provide the snacks in this instance, we hope lots of you will join us to kind of continue the conversation and, you know, try and make those connections to help, I suppose, you know, support your work in this area. It will also give you an opportunity to speak to some of our panel in more detail and, you know, just bump into people that you're not bumping into at the moment, as most of us are still working remotely. So this is just the idea of the agenda today, and I'm going to kick off with the 3 barriers that we're aware are affecting a lot of us. I'm going to ask Robert McDermott from Countryside to start by talking to us about the issue of a lack of appropriate skills to capitalise on a green and fair recovery. Over to you, Robert.
Hi and welcome everybody. Yeah, just following on from what Hannah was saying, I guess when we look at the scale of challenge and opportunity in this building recovery, I maybe may flip it around and perhaps look at this more from an opportunity perspective. And I'll do that in 3 ways. First of all, looking at the scale of that opportunity, then perhaps touching on Countryside's approach to dealing with this and addressing this opportunity, and then finally, then if you like, try and piece that together in terms of how that would then work in action. So throw some facts and figures your way. So we've got a government, as you're aware, that have committed to becoming carbon net zero by 2050. What does that mean? Well, that means we've got Britain's 28 million homes are going to need to contribute to 20% reduction in those emissions in totality, which ultimately means a sizable retrofit piece, which is essentially if we're going to any chance of meeting these net zero targets. Really what we need to do is made great progress on that journey by about 2028. And what I mean by that is we'll need all the homes in the UK really to be at least the energy performance certificate level of C. And in economic terms, that's probably around about £15,000 to £20,000 per home to get them up to that energy performance level. The good news will be that I'll be looking at a reduction in people's energy bills around £500 per year, so that'll be more money in people's pockets. And then how do we meet that challenge, or how do we seize the opportunity? So CITB in a report March of this year, Building Skills for Net Zero, said in reality that's going to relate to the necessity for 350,000 new construction roles. And that isn't just all hands-on people. There's going to be, I mean, the likes of 86,000 construction project managers needed, over 60,000 plumbers and HVAC specialists. So I think all of that presents a fantastic opportunity, really. Whilst we recognise there's generally a skill shortage in the industry, if people appreciate that this is a fantastic opportunity to seize and they can make a big difference, and I think that's going to be quite appealing to people. And actually, whilst we're talking perhaps of a journey of a 10, 20-year lifespan, in reality, this is going to take people from school all the way up to retirement as a challenge that society faces. If I then relate that to what we're doing as an organisation, so we set science-based targets that will look to reduce our carbon emissions, not only in our construction operations, but also in the homes we build, making them more energy efficient. And to do that, we're absolutely going to have to work much closer with our supply chain to achieve these targets. We've made a commitment that 50% of the homes we build will be using modern methods of construction. And again, that's an exciting proposition, I think, for new people to the industry to think they're going to be part of that journey. On the social side, we're targeting to deliver at least 30% social, local economic value in every single development. And in support of that, create local job creation, training and employment plans for all of our regions and all of our developments. So then just piecing that together. So as I mentioned, we're absolutely going to need to work very closely with our supply chain to transition our construction operations. We work alongside them in developing recruitment, training plans that not only supports us on the journey, but can also move us towards these more innovative methods of construction. I think it's really important as well that we share our growth plans with our supply chain and give them that kind of long-term certainty that they can also invest in their people and in developing skills and apprenticeship schemes alongside that. We're absolutely going to need to develop more dynamic purchasing processes that provide routes into countryside for all levels of supply chain, from the very big to the very small micro enterprises. Just picking up again upon these plans, we've resourced that internally, and we're putting in place regional community development managers that can work in local areas to build up these job creation plans, but also look more towards the future and how we can get people more interested in getting involved in construction and recognise the challenges ahead and how they can play their part. So in summary, I do think there's some fantastic opportunities ahead for us, and I think what it'll do is provide this focus that will help build on this kind of post-recovery movement, really, and give us that, as I say, that focal point for our attentions and efforts going forward, I think.
Thanks, Robert. And yeah, it's really great to start on a positive and seeing the opportunity. Thanks for that. Next to Jude from the Greater London Authority, who's going to give her thoughts on how procurement and decision making are favouring profit over social value. Jude.
Hi everyone, and thanks to Future of London for inviting me here today. It's great to be here. So I've been working for the last 18 months with the London Sustainable Development Commission to understand how to improve the social impact, positive social impact of regeneration and development in London. For those of you who don't know it, the Commission advises the Mayor of London on his duty to deliver sustainable development in the capital. Sadly, the evidence points to there being a real need for this work now. We've got evidence in the form of research. For example, I think you're probably all familiar with the Grosvenor Group, around the lack of public trust in development. And also, obviously, the pandemic has highlighted the huge inequality that exists in the city, impacting some of the populations who live in areas of high deprivation particularly hard. So for the purpose of this talk, I've been asked to address procurement, which is obviously a powerful lever for increasing the social impact of development. And the question to me was, is it fundamentally compromised by the need to drive economic rather than social gains? Well, you'll all know procurement is one of the main ways that the development industry chooses to deliver social value. It's mandated through the Public Services or so-called Social Value Act. So there are clear requirements for delivery. The problem, however, we think is that procurement is sometimes dealt with in isolation, and it can be a bit of a blunt instrument, sometimes approached like a bit of a tick box exercise, with developers and contractors choosing from a menu of sometimes identikit measures that can partially answer a need. And I've got full respect for these, don't get me wrong, but things like apprenticeships and training, they have their role, but they do sometimes leave more sort of fundamental and difficult issues not tackled. Measures selected can sometimes be based on financial expediency and ease of delivery, rather than a commitment to delivering value from the community perspective. So the problem for us and the challenge is that delivering positive social impact as part of regeneration is complex, it's difficult, it's potentially costly, and it requires a really comprehensive and long-sighted approach, which needs to go far beyond procurement. It needs a really clear understanding of the community impacted by the development, their lived experience and what's of value to them. That will require dealing with the complexity of how to measure social impact, including issues like well-being and happiness, which can be difficult to integrate within tools based on qualitative assessment for bottom line financial reporting. And it will also require a repivot of the focus of development to answer community need, not just developer need. Essentially, it's about ceding power and going the hard yards to deliver on a shared understanding of what's important to the communities impacted. It'll require a commitment to go beyond procurement and build social value into strategies and delivery from the outset of the development process. So through planning, design, construction, and in use, and co-created, importantly, with the active participation of communities. So all that sounds great, but I can hear you all thinking, how much will that cost? And you're right, yeah, short term, the costs could be high. But at this point, I think we should possibly reflect on another element of sustainable development to challenge our way of thinking about social impact. And that way is environmental impact. So addressing the environmental impact of development used to be a bit of a tick box exercise as well, delivered by some, not by others, until we really started to understand and think about the risks of not including environmental impact within development and regeneration. And we now understand and mitigate those risks, and increasingly policy and regulation are moving towards a much more risk-based approach. So I just wonder whether now is the time to take the same approach to social impact. We understand the role that development has in building resilient, thriving communities. And so responses need to look much further than procurement and much, much longer term, and factor in the costs associated with not delivering positive social impact, some of which we're seeing now in the communities around this city in particular. The bottom line needs to incorporate the risks of not delivering for communities now and into the future, and needs to be based on a clear understanding of how to positively impact the communities that are being served. So in summary, I've got a few final thoughts to leave you with. That procurement is one of the tools that can be used, but to be effective, it needs not to be the only one. That social value should be shaped by and with communities and individuals impacted by development from the very beginning of the process and run like a golden thread through it. And that we need to embrace complexity of how to deliver positive social impact to communities. And that we need to understand the risks of poor delivery and collectively consider who pays ultimately for bad development that doesn't deliver, and in some instances that heightens exclusion, unfairness and disadvantage.
Thanks, Jude. And yeah, I think highlighting some really important points to get us thinking holistically. So that's great. Finally, for this section, I'm going to Anouk Khan from Real Estate Women, who will give her thoughts on how a lack of diversity in the built environment sector can lead to the creation of places and policies that exclude. Anouk.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you to Future of London for inviting me to this much needed discussion with this brilliant panel and audience. My name is Anouk Khan. I'm Operations Director for Real Estate Women. Real Estate Women is a gender network that was set up in 2012 to push for greater diversity and inclusion in the property and the built environment. Our work involves building a community. We're now global, so we're across the UK, in Europe, parts of Africa and the US. And one of the reasons we exist is because we found there was a gap between conferences and even now high-profile networking webinars where really a very limited talent base is reflected. And what we do is to create an inclusive and safe space for networking and to really showcase a broad case of talent base from communities that may not be represented in the built environment. So in terms of what we'll be looking at today is looking at the gender pay gap, looking at retention and attracting talent to the built environment, and also leadership. So to highlight that, let me share some data in terms of what we've seen on diversity and inclusion, especially during the pandemic. As you can imagine, the pandemic has really dampened progress on the gender pay gap. I'll share some figures with you. The gap has widened for men and women at 27%, up from 17% in 2019. So that's quite a wide gap. But what's more pressing and concerning is the ethnicity pay gap. For the first time, we actually have some data on this. And the difference in median salary between a white person and those from a BAME background stands at 20%. And of course, as you can imagine, if you're from a Black background, that percentage is much lower. And when we look at who the culprits are, if you like, asset management comes out top for equal pay and remuneration, whereas property management companies and corporate real estate are amongst the lowest rankings. But it's not just about the base salary. I think now we're looking at what drives people. It's also the bonus, pension, well-being. And we've seen that a report by McDonald's and Company that there's still, in terms of ethnicity, a 26% benefits gap between those from a BAME background and those from a non-BAME background. And again, the gap between those from a Black community are much lower. So in terms of what we did last year, spurred by Black Lives Matter and also seeing the inequalities in the pandemic, we started to broaden our network to reach out to women from other communities to come and talk to us so we can share their lived experiences. I mean, we cannot build back a city or a country on a small pool of talent. That talent has to spread to other people of different lived experiences. So in terms of what we see as solutions, well, first, it's a huge challenge to build back in terms of the gender pay gap. I think a lot of work has to be done at the government level, at the corporate level, at the individual level. In terms of solutions, I think wider transparency, more data gathering is critical. And finally, I think collaboration between groups like Future of London and others is key to get that message across. Thank you.
Thank you, Anouk. Couldn't agree more. And I think just from those three introductions, we can already start to see some really big topics, but also a lot that we can all relate to. We're now going to move around the panel who reflect on these issues from their own perspectives. And I hope sort of start to make clear some of these areas of common ground. So staying on the topic of diversity for now, Paul De Silva from Friends of the Earth, your report, England's Green Space Gap, outlines the correlation between access to good quality green space and ethnicity and income. Can you give us a couple of the headlines to indicate the scale of the issue?
Yeah, thanks very much. Yes, so from gender gaps and pay gaps to green space gaps. So yeah, the Green Space Gap report that I wrote for Friends of the Earth last year, and is still doing the rounds, is the first kind of England-wide analysis of the official data to look at whether people are getting their fair share of green space provision in their local area. And the data, it's all using official data, ONS data, basically concludes that there's strong correlations between income levels and ethnicity and availability of quality green space in an area. And that basically means that a large number of people, about 1 in 5 people in England, millions, are missing out on the benefits that many communities would otherwise expect as normal for their area. And I think those things existed before the pandemic, but they've certainly come to the fore as a result of it. And in London, 17 of the 25 worst areas for green space deprivation are in London. So 17 out of 25 in England. The top 17 are, the top 25, of the top 25, 17 are in London, which you may well expect for various reasons, but I think it's quite stark. So we'll have to see how things go, but it does touch on the whole issue of urban design, planning decisions and planning pressures, the community voice, and factoring people's real needs for green space. And I don't just mean parks.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And I'm sure people would be really keen to read it. So if you can pop a link in the chat, that would be fab. Going to move on to Sam Boyle from Business Disability Forum. Sam, when we met, we chatted about adjustments to make experience in public spaces more comfortable and welcoming for people with disabilities and long-term health conditions. Is there anything we can learn from the past year to change our approach to this?
Thanks so much, Hannah, and welcome everyone, and thanks for inviting me. So yes, I think there are kind of two broad things to think about in terms of the workplace in particular. So I think on a positive note, the changes to working patterns over the last year has been brilliant for many people with disabilities, not all, but most. You know, flexible working, the ability to take off time for appointments, even home working, some of these things disabled people have wanted for years and, you know, within a space of weeks at the beginning of the pandemic, disabled people were getting these adjustments and kind of these barriers were being removed to an extent. However, what's rather less encouraging is the disability employment gap has gone up over the last year. So say people have been more disproportionately furloughed, they've been disproportionately made redundant, and they've been disproportionately kind of having to take long-term leave due to the need to shield and, you know, kind of difficulties in actually being able to access their jobs in the normal way. And understandably, there's going to be a challenge coming forward with the fact that social distancing is coming to an end in June. So whilst we've heard many organisations want to make flexible working the norm, some businesses have kind of rowed back a little bit on this, and that will cause some anxiety. So what we can do on that front is really try and make the case for flexible working being the norm rather than the exception, or at least the option to have flexible working. And the government is going to be introducing flexible working guidance soon, and we will be advocating very, very strongly for flexible working being a widely kind of accepted thing throughout society. We can't go back to the old normal. Another thing we can think about is some of the long-term challenges that existed before COVID that might have been exacerbated in some circumstances. So whilst employers have adapted very quickly to supporting many of their employees, some government schemes haven't really worked that well, or at least not as well as they could do. So for example, Access to Work, which is a kind of government grant which provides and funds adjustments for disabled employees, it basically is overly bureaucratic, and the process takes a long time for adjustments to come through that support disabled people. Now, this isn't good if you're starting a new job and you don't have those adjustments in place, when it's just kind of additional barriers for disabled people. So we are making the case to government and to other stakeholders that Access to Work needs to be reformed. Disabled people should be able to access to work and start their applications when they are applying or progressing applications for jobs, rather than having to wait till they've started in a job and then they've got that extra burden to do alongside starting a new job, which we all can understand can be quite stressful and fatigue inducing. And it's only by kind of breaking down some of these barriers that we can, and kind of including disabled people in our workforces, that we can truly build kind of a more inclusive and better London, and as well as other cities, a better kind of society really, which is more productive and more inclusive and encouraging for all our citizens. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I think a lot of principles that we can all relate to there. And I think there's a similar conversation to be had about how we move around our cities. So, Joanna, your work as a freelance transport planner and as a member of Women in Transport does focus on equality. As we enter recovery, how can we ensure that we're designing transport schemes not just for one sort of person?
Yeah, I think that's a really important topic. So thank you for inviting me to take part in this afternoon. I think there's some sort of following on from some of the things the speakers have already said. I think there's a common thread in all of this. One example I was thinking of was the narrative that's going on about the return to the workplace, however that might look. We've all been working through all of this, but return to office spaces and how that might be affected in terms of ticketing. So for a long time, there has been an issue over chain trips that some people have been aware of and some people have suffered from. I have to say predominantly it's been women, because they have over history done about 75% of the caring things, which has meant that they've been affected by this chain trip issue, which is the one where you're dropping off children for school or nursery, then maybe having to take an elderly relative for an appointment and then doing up the predominant amount of the shopping. I know that doesn't happen in every household, and that's quite a sweeping statement, but it is predominantly across Europe what's happening. And that means that they're not able to take the benefit of the of ticketing that allows you to buy weekly passes and that kind of thing, and monthly passes. And that's something that's going to affect all of us now, actually, as we move to this, those of us who work in offices, as we move to this hybrid. It doesn't look like many of us are going to go back to this 5-day-a-week working in an office or a city, which means that none of us are going to be able to benefit from this ticketing issue. So the ticketing thing is just one issue that the transport industry needs to look at and is going to have to look at urgently. And it's going to be very interesting to see how quickly it can be sorted now it affects a bigger amount of the population. I think also a kind of a big thing that is affecting all built environment specialists is this fact that we haven't been as diverse as we perhaps could have been, and we need to work on that. We simply, as Sam said in his presentation, simply cannot go back to the old normals. That's not acceptable anymore. We need to be thinking about building and developing our cities and meeting places for as many people as possible, and that means we need as many people as possible taking part in the conversation. That means we need a more diverse profession, but we also need to be encouraging people to take part in consultations about the kind of cities they want to live in, and the responsibility is with all of us. That's something that we can all do as built environment professionals, by encouraging people, talking to people about what we do, and having pride in our work. What other career do we get where we get to influence the way people live, work and play every day of our lives?
Thanks, Jo. Yeah, really inspiring, and I think it's great to have a sort of call to action like that for all of us. You'll have a lot of sympathetic people in the audience for sure. I'm going to move to Jatinder Bal, who's Director of Land at Metropolitan Thames Valley Housing. Jatinder, what are your reflections on the issue of affordability of housing and how this affects a thriving and diverse city, and how's COVID changed this?
Thank you, Hannah. Yeah, I mean, affordability has always been a massive challenge, but I think before we sort of look at that, I think it's probably worth reflecting on what makes a thriving city. And in my opinion, it's very much the people. It's the diversity of the people, be it the brain power, the creativity, the entrepreneurial spirit. And I think there's always been a challenge in terms of retaining that within a successful city, but also very importantly, attracting that. And I think what COVID's done in the matter of, in regards to affordability, like a number of other things, it's really shone a light on that in terms of some of those disparities. And it's really interesting to hear some of the previous speakers in regards to inequality across income ranges, which is very, very intrinsically linked to affordability. Unfortunately, with COVID, those on the lower ends of the economic scale have probably suffered the most, and that, I think, is exacerbated when it comes to housing and housing cost. But I think there's also a cohort there of those who are surviving, who I think have found themselves in even more challenging circumstances, where actually having lockdown, being quarantined, being stuck in sometimes inappropriate sized accommodation for their family composition, I think is probably also been exacerbated in this period of time. And I think, you know, there's definitely, I would suggest from my view and everyone I've spoken to, a greater appreciation of the essential workers, be it the clapping for the NHS workers on a Thursday, and everything that goes with it. You know, I think there's a there's an undercurrent of people who are absolutely essential to make the city thrive. And I think there's a bigger understanding of that. But that doesn't mean the challenge is any easier. And I think the real key for us as an organisation, we've always been very involved in affordable housing, is saying, how do we have this step change in terms of ensuring we can bring the right quality of housing for the people at an affordable range. Now, there's a variety of products, and we're going to have a little networking group later, and I'm happy to discuss all of them. But I think the reality there is about appropriate sized accommodation, appropriately priced accommodation in the right locations in any city in order to ensure its longevity.
Yeah, thanks, Jatinder. And again, reflecting on those people who were sort of most valuing, but and have done over the last year. But the question is how, right? But yeah, I think we'll sort of start to get to those answers as we go through the programme. I'm going to take a bit of a step back now and look at some of the bigger trends and kind of bigger picture that some of the panellists are recognising. So I'm going to go to Anthony from Lewis Silkin. What are your thoughts on the main barriers to ensuring social value is prioritised when it comes to the creation of public space?
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks for the invitation from Future of London to just spend a couple of minutes talking about this. In true legal fashion, I'm going to start in the definition section and just say that it really is that lack of definition of social value that I think we struggle with. I work a lot with developers, with local authorities, and to try and understand what it is we mean by delivering social value. Is it health and well-being? Obviously a priority more so over the last a short while during the pandemic. Is it jobs and economic growth, or is it building the strength of the community? Probably an amalgamation of all of those things, really. But it could be many other things. So I think there's kind of a bit of a lack of understanding of definition, and aligned to that, I think it's also difficult to measure it. Now, during my kind of research into my students this afternoon, I came across a myriad of different kind of measures, and that there's no consistency of approach. So it's difficult for developers, or when kind of talking about development, talking about public spaces, public realm, well, how do we measure the social value that's going to be that we get from that? Then I think the next topic that I would kind of issue that I would mention is just the multitude of stakeholders, from your local authority to the planning authority, to developer, to your residents, to your community. It's kind of those competing interests. And really, that calls for a lot of collaboration and a lot of leadership amongst those organisations. And hopefully the leadership will come from the local community, but it will depend on the developer to a degree, and on how invested they are. But I think that tension between the different stakeholders creates issues for us. And then just, possibly just kind of a lack of trust between the public and private sectors in delivering this. I mean, I think, that's not new. But, if the private sector are required to deliver this as part of their developments, where are they seeing the benefit from it? And do the public sector trust them to deliver that? Then, of course, key is engagement with the local community and understanding what the local community need in terms of the enhancement of their social value. And I suppose the question then, and again, it's probably one of the definition, well, what is the local community? How do we define that? Who is representative of the local community? And I would say, in response to the particular question that Hannah's asked me this afternoon, that actually around kind of creating social value through kind of public realm and public space, actually probably the more diverse communities, which may be more difficult to define what that is, it's almost more important to be able to create that social value. I think just in terms of kind of physical issues, there's obviously the space, there's the land, particularly in London. Kind of where do you get the land for the public, for the public realm, and then also obviously kind of safety and security issues is a big barrier to delivering that social value. And then really just to kind of close off really kind of a very whistle-stop tour is just obviously the cost and viability. Social value, there's no kind of a traditional way of measuring social value when developers are putting together viability statements. Of course, there's the different elements of the development cycle that social value is being delivered at. Now, if we're talking about public space, I mean, what I would really want to focus on there is kind of the long-term maintenance of that. So it's all very well having it delivered, having the public realm delivered with a certain amount of social value, but who takes long-term ownership and who's able to finance that long-term maintenance of that public space. It's a very whistle-stop tour of some of the areas that I've seen.
Thanks very much, Anthony. I'm going to move to Samuel Blake from Montague Evans to talk about travel and transport. So travel patterns have and obviously are continuing to change as a result of the pandemic, which we've already reflected on a little bit. How do we make sure that decisions we make now with regards to transport schemes are fair?
Thanks, Hannah. The pandemic has undoubtedly changed travel patterns in terms of public transport. Less overall use, in particular at peak times, may continue as working patterns have rapidly evolved. However, it does remain to be seen quite how sticky these new trends will be. London dwellers are now more likely to buy a car sooner than planned than in any other region of the UK, according to figures from the largest motor finance group. Now, if you've been around areas of inner London recently, from Woolworth to Wandsworth, a huge exercise in road closure has taken place, coinciding with the pandemic. These quick decisions were taken without consultation. The intention was to encourage novice cyclists to use quieter streets whilst providing pedestrians with space to aid social distancing. Is this fair? If you're on a neighbourhood app, you will have likely seen widespread exasperation with the schemes. People are losing an inner city rat run, in some cases taking a huge issue with it as it disrupts their lives. Also noting that often those reliant on cars have a disability of some sort, particularly in zones 1 and 2. On the other hand, for those not reliant on cars, things could get quite exciting. Roads take up an enormous amount of physical space in our city. So aside from a boost to self-propelled transport, these newly closed spaces could offer more than just a few planters and benches. Here's a few ideas. You could have wellbeing pop-ups, so local temporary centres that reach out to a community on health matters. You could also have affordable workspace, boosting opportunity for local business. So now onto the elephant in the room, electric vehicles. With these becoming the only new option by 2030 and gas guzzling cars likely to be taxed into oblivion, that leaves only 8.5 years to get sufficient infrastructure in place for this takeover. Currently, there are circa 6,000 charging stations in the capital, yet we have more than 2.6 million registered vehicles. Electric cars are also significantly more expensive, at least for now. So there will need to be a huge push and significant cooperation to get chargers in place across the capital, with the GLA, London boroughs and developers working closely together. So to sum up, I would say that the trade-off between public transport, road use and new technology will really be a tightrope that we must navigate very carefully and also with fairness in mind.
Thanks, Sam. And I think, yeah, it seems like there's a real urgency for us to kind of get to grips with some of this stuff. I'm going to go to Letitia now from Arup. You've been working with the GLA on emerging trends when it comes to culture. What, from your recent insight, is the risk to London if we neglect culture in our recovery?
Thanks, Hannah. So as you said, our team have recently finished some work for the GLA looking at the impact of COVID and Brexit on the economy of the Central Activity Zone. Art and cultural institutions are an essential part of the overall economic ecosystem of the CAZ, driven by footfall from tourists, visitors and workers. London-wide, arts and culture represent a £58 billion contribution to annual GVA, and the sector also employs 26,000 people in the Central Activity Zone alone. But more than just driving tourists and visitors to the city, the arts have a major influence on London's international reputation and attracts employees, students and companies to London, perhaps even more so than career prospects or economic opportunities. I also think the other thing to consider is that Central London is not just home to major institutions such as the Tate or the Royal Opera House. It's also home to many hundreds of grassroots music venues and small galleries. These are often a rich breeding ground for up-and-coming talent and in many ways gives London its reputation for edginess and trend-setting. It is these venues that have suffered the most, and it is likely that as public purse strings are tightened to tackle the overall economic fallout of the pandemic, they will see their funding reduced, which in turn could impact London's international reputation, not to mention fail to support artists in their early careers. But we must also remember, in fact, that many of the larger institutions as well also rely on some public funding and provide access to the arts for people of all backgrounds and ages, often for free. Ensuring this level of inclusive access to the arts is maintained is really, really important. So I think for me, the key message is that the arts and culture industries must be supported in recovery, not only to protect inclusive access to the arts, but also to protect the overall economic ecosystem of Central London.
Yeah, thanks, Letitia. I know there's a lot of talk about the major investment in culture through the Cultural Recovery Fund, but perhaps some questions about whether that's being channeled in the right places. With that in mind, Jonathan, what has London Borough of Waltham Forest's experience been? What have you learned about the value of culture and economic development through your involvement with the London Borough of Culture programme?
Thank you very much, Hannah, and just like to say, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm Jonathan Martin, Director of Inward Investment at Waltham Forest, and what's been clear for us in terms of lessons learned from the Borough of Culture, which we hosted in 2019, is that it's absolutely essential to bind people together. Clearly, from the impact of COVID and the lockdowns, we've seen how culture and nighttime economies have obviously suffered through the lack of venues being able to be open. What we had initially as that programme of events in the borough were 5 key tenets, which were around basically a culture as an identity, a bond. We were looking at how we could increase cultural capacity. We were looking at how we could generate careers out of it, and strongly around how we could make sure culture was on every corner. So that went a long way to how we started to shape our sort of early thoughts around the 15-minute neighbourhood and hyper locality in terms of shopping local. What did that mean for people in terms of the places they were in and how we could embed that? We looked at how the Borough of Culture attracted a lot of people to various events, of which we had 10 hero events, which were significant in the borough in attracting in visitors, both within the borough, but also external to the borough, of which we managed to achieve 500,000 visitors across the year. That was really important for us. It raised and promoted the destinations. We looked at how we could start to really build on that in terms of giving to some of these boroughs or these wards within the borough this sort of cultural identity, so cultural suburbs. And that was something that, again, was welcomed by all, because it wasn't just about economic development, meaning growth through housing and jobs and stresses on things like parking and so forth. So it was something everyone welcomed. What else did it bring forward in terms of our sort of legacy since then? We've looked at how we could embed culture in regeneration projects and schemes. So as a sort of function of the success of the Borough of Culture, we've bought a cinema, EMD Granada Cinema, which we're basically converting into a 950-seater theatre, which will be the largest comedy venue outside of central London. We believe we'll have the capacity to pull people in from outside of the borough, which we're really excited about. That will be open next year, and we can start to really work in partnership, which is a big part of the other lesson that we learned, which was around partnership working, networks, people starting to meet with their neighbours, with communities, and how we could bring those people together to really act as that bond, as I mentioned before. What did it also do for us in terms of funding? We attracted funding in terms of our investors and our developers. They could see the value of culture in setting a place, in really starting to give a place a destination, a USP around how we could really maximise some of those assets already in the borough. And we think that's really important, particularly when we start to look at things such as the MD Theatre. We've started to embed cultural space within new schemes that are coming forward. For example, in Lee Bridge to the south of the borough, we're bringing forward a mixed-use scheme with over 1,500 square metres of cultural space to be brought forward. So that's how we're embedding that space. We're looking at how we can generate careers for people in the cultural industries. And again, that will help with the economic development and economic growth of the borough, which we see as absolutely key. Nighttime economy, we're working on how we can, again, partner with our providers to make sure culture is pan-borough. It's also spread for diversity for all. So culture means different things to different people. So we had a bottom-up approach as well as a top-down to make sure that it had that fair sort of diversity and inclusion, so that it reflected the communities within the borough. So that has gone forward in terms of a lesson that we will take forward into our economic growth. And finally, just in terms of supporting that sort of diversity arts and culture. We've looked at how we can support our creative industries and give them the support and potentially the sort of pipeline of new entrants into the business that can really see the borough start to grow, not just in terms of its own locality, but also as an attractor for this part of London, in North East London, and as part of London as a whole, in terms of bringing people into that sort of cultural family that we really relish. And I think certainly the biggest impact I think we've all seen is that the lockdowns really did impact on how we could enjoy cultural and leisure activities. And that goes beyond economic development, it goes into health and well-being. So it's something that's a really fundamental part of what we're looking to address in our programmes moving forwards over the next couple of years, starting pretty much from this summer when we relaunch and kickstart our new programme of activity that will be on a face-to-face basis.
Sorry, Jonathan, to cut you off in your flow. We're going to have to move on, but it's really great to hear about how that stuff's being embedded long term, which I think is a really important lesson. Before we move on to questions from the audience, we'll hear a bit more from the rest of our panel about how some of this stuff is sort of having an impact on the ground. I'm going to start with Stephen Morris at Pollard Thomas Edwards. What lessons have you learned from COVID with regards to housing design, and how can we adapt our thinking to make sure that we're designing inclusively for communities of the future?
Well, thank you, Hannah, and it's great to hear some of the thoughts today. Definitely a common thread forming with everyone. I suppose for us, one of the greatest or the most noticeable impacts that we've felt here is in London, the majority of our schemes that we design are apartment-led, and that many of the kind of monofit layouts that are favoured by developers for efficiency and viability, and also the sales-friendly open plan living, dining, kitchen arrangement that we're all quite familiar with, they're just not really as suitable in a post-COVID world. Like the design of where we live and where we want to live needs to be flexible, needs to be inclusive enough, but it also needs to provide that feeling of home. It might have to be an occasional workplace, a sometimes school for those that have kids that are very aware of that, a place to care for someone, and ultimately also a place of respite in the midst of all of those other activities. So it's quite a challenge to kind of fit all those things in with design. The London plan is going in the right direction. It's got lots of things about daylight, dual aspect, and all the things that make great places. But as Jatinder picked up on earlier on, the nationally described space standards that we all have to work to quite often don't necessarily allow for all of those desirable things that we want in a home. So it's kind of a discussion between council and developers and how we can get that kind of thing. Developers are asking us at the moment, and they're asking us to look at solutions to address this new future. And I suppose maybe future isn't the right word because it's almost a return to a more recent past. You know, I'm one of the lucky ones that has a Victorian mansion block apartment in Hackney, quite spacious, kitchen diner separate from the living space. And that's been absolutely invaluable in the last year, you know, for a couple and some dogs living and working and breathing every day in the same place. So it's not the same for everyone, I'm aware. Another thing that's been really clear this year is the kind of idea about isolation and its impact on mental health in design. You know, we've been looking at this in our practice a lot for the last 10 years, thinking about housing for older people, but actually it's apparent this year that that's actually relevant to everyone of all ages. You know, communities are built on these connections and networks and a diversity of peoples and ages, and new developments really need to consider that sociability within the design of things. Who's going to live there throughout the different times of the day? What kind of neighbours will you have? You know, can your parents live nearby? Where can you go and get your groceries and meet people? And that became really, really obvious during the pandemic when our locality, and I think, you know, Jonathan's just alluded to that, became our whole world. You know, the idea of the 15-minute neighbourhood became something very apparent in the last year, because I know that Lower Clapton was my neighbourhood and that was the only place I really went. So we need to think as moving forward more holistically about how we can enhance or create diverse neighbourhoods, and then also think about who is actually designing those, because they need to be inviting, they need to be accessible, they need to be multi-use, and also they need to be nearby. But then we also have to consider that, you know, those things don't come with one set of minds. It's lots of different landowners and lots of different stakeholders that make up that. So thank you, Hannah.
Absolutely, thank you, Stephen. And those sort of changing patterns in use are happening outside the home, as you allude to, as well as inside. So Hamali, how are you responding to increasing demand being placed on your open spaces in London Borough of Southwark, either through regeneration or COVID? And how do you keep up the high standards to make sure that green space is welcoming?
Thank you, Hannah. So I manage a portfolio of projects within Southwark to deliver new homes to the borough. We have a commitment to deliver 11,000 new homes by 2043. Southwark being an in London borough, we're working with very constrained sites. So we're trying to maximise the number of units on those schemes.
Well, I think
that with provision of open space. I'm delivering. Can you hear me okay?
Your connection's a bit dodgy. I might ask you to just turn off your video for now, Hermione, and hopefully we'll be able to hear you.
I'm delivering a scheme at the moment, which is on the boundary of Burgess Park. So we're able to offset some of that provision by the fact that Burgess Park is on its doorstep. But then if a number of schemes take that same approach, it starts putting a toll on our parks and open spaces. But we're quite fortunate that we've got great term contractors on board who are able to deal with the increase in demand and have been able to in the last year as well. But in regeneration as well, we recognise that we need to provide accessible and open space to our new residents. Another scheme that I'm also overseeing is Peckham Rye Station Square project, which is a great public realm project. And the key to that was engagement with our residents and trying to understand what it was they want from an open space. And especially in the last year, it's become really apparent how important it is for our residents to have access to open space. So Southwark is the largest social housing provider in London, so a lot of our residents live in flats, and it's important for them to be able to access open space regularly and nearby as well, and a space that is, it provides, it suits their needs. So, it's really important for their health and well-being. So, we're fortunate in Southwark to have 130 parks and open spaces, but we're also delivering other public realm projects within the borough to address that as well.
Yeah, great.
Thank you, Anna.
Comes back to Paul's point about it's not just parks. And on the topic of community engagement, we'll now go to Laura Rattling from the City of London Corporation. So you do lots of work, Laura, with lesser heard communities using art and culture as an engagement tool. What's the potential of cultural engagement in recovery, and what needs to change for us to make effective use of it?
Great, thank you, Hannah. And it's really good to be part of this fascinating conversation. So as you say, I'm in the community engagement team at the City of London, and we always refer to the wider community that we work with. So that's residents, workers, organisations, businesses, amongst many other people. My work is primarily in Aldgate and Aldgate East, so that's an area with a history of immense cultural diversity and also acute power dynamics, because it straddles the borough of Tower Hamlets and the City of London. It's also an area that's on the cusp of regeneration and therefore potentially also gentrification. I lead on, amongst other things, a co-created annual festival and parade with 30 community and cultural partners, and a co-produced community engagement strategy which underpins a vast public realm programme to revitalise the historic Petticoat Lane Market. And I'm sure many of you have been involved with a lot of conversations about building back better. And for me, cultural participation has to be absolutely central to recovery. And building back better can only take place if space is made for new and multiple voices, and people have autonomy over their own existences and the space around them. And this is all central to the notion of the right to the city, which underpins the work that I do, in which people have the freedom to remake their cities and themselves. The projects that I'm involved with aim to empower communities and navigate space for fresh voices in processes of social change. And cultural participation in general can help communities to reclaim their streets, build a sense of ownership over public space, make communities visible, amplify voices, and democratize decision-making processes, as well as build skills and confidence, all of which I believe is fundamental to an equal and fairer society. And as people have touched upon before, particularly Jude at the beginning of this conversation, there are multiple barriers to this, and genuine engagement and genuine participation requires both time and flexibility. So all of that needs to be built into people's strategies, budgets, resources, and schedules. Decision-making processes need to open up across the board. And crucially, people from authorities, councillors, planners, developers, architects, and artists all need to be ready to relinquish power and let new voices in.
Thanks, Laura. And actually, you're reflecting a little bit what someone, Martina's saying in the chat about us need to embrace a sort of more of a flexible approach. We've just got 2 more speakers to hear from, and they're going to focus a bit more on skills. So Luke, what can you tell us about the issues you're seeing in the London Borough of Barnet as your skills and employment programmes try to sort of adapt to a rise in demand for their service, as well as a change in the available opportunities for people out of work?
Thanks, Hannah. It's great to be here this afternoon as well, and thanks for the invitation. So just a couple of points on Barnet, the place, for those of you who might not be familiar. So we're the largest borough in London. We've got over 400,000 people, 23,000 registered businesses. The interesting thing about that is we're overwhelmingly a small and micro business economy, very few big names here. So what that means is lots of retail, lots of hospitality businesses with small numbers of employees, but who have also been amongst the most heavily impacted sectors in the economy. We'll all have a similar story, I suspect, if we're offices and councils, and we'll have seen the newspaper headlines, particularly about shops and restaurants kind of closing over the last year. So we know that the people who work in those sectors often tend to be at the lower end of the income and skills spectrum, and therefore they're the people who have been most impacted in terms of their health and well-being and their wider outcomes in life from the pandemic. So there's all sorts of multiple wicked issues there that actually kind of become a very high priority for us. Just a couple of stats for the borough. So we had 3.5% unemployment just before the pandemic. That's crept up to just under 6% now, and as with the rest of London, we're expecting that to go higher still before the end of the year. We're actually on 7.5% of the working age population with some kind of unemployment benefits now. So I think the point I'm making there is that this is the challenge of our generation fundamentally. When we look at the economic and the kind of longer term health and well-being and demand impacts on the economy. In terms of the questions, a couple of the issues we've been seeing. So I think 3 really quick ones. So outside of the pandemic, the existing trends we were seeing before, so technological change, the role of office space and land in the economy, they've all been accelerated. We're all spending more online. There's going to be an implication for that on our high streets. What does that mean for our skills and employment provision and the way people work in the borough? Many of the people who've lost their jobs, they'll have lost their jobs for the first time. They don't see themselves as unemployed. They're not the people we're used to dealing with. They're not the normal people or cohorts who would work with in the construction sector, for instance, through our Section 106 programmes. Really important point there, because it fundamentally defines what our response needs to look like. And then finally, a lot of the skills programmes that we had before the pandemic, dealing with smaller cohorts of high needs individuals, they're still important, but they're just not the solution for the next 3 or 4 years, which is going to be fundamentally about dealing with scale, about dealing with pace, and dealing with different sectors that are going to be growing to replace the ones retail and hospitality fundamentally. So really quickly, what does our response look like? We need a new model for employment and skills in the country generally. We're developing that currently in Barnet through our new skills and employment strategy. Much bigger focus on growth sectors, particularly construction, health and care. Thousands and thousands of new jobs being created in those over the next 10 years. And what I call the pivots, which is how do we shift all of the thousands of people we had been encouraging into lower level jobs in retail and hospitality and other sectors into those growth sectors. If we don't do that, there's going to be long-term impacts for all of us, which are going to be felt for the next 20, 30 years. In Barnet, just before I finish, we'll be refreshing our Section 106 policy. The current approaches to Section 106 and creating jobs in construction, they're simply not fit for purpose. I mean, there's a whole discussion there, which I don't have time to go into. Developing new pathways with colleges, with universities, with the NHS.
Really
and
sorry,
care
Luke, to interrupt you, but we're going
that was it.
Really fantastic to hear the action that you're taking. And Paul, now last, very much not least, we're going to Paul. You had some really insightful reflections when we spoke about the issues facing young people at the moment when it comes to skills and employment. What are you hearing, and what are L&Q doing to address the issues?
Well, first of all, can I say I'm highly delighted to be taking part in today's event, and I want to congratulate my predecessors on manfully trying to keep to the 2-minute restriction that was imposed. So well done, everyone. I suppose, you know, what I'm talking about is just one small part of what L&Q is doing in respect to some of the issues that we face post-pandemic. Like every business across the globe, L&Q will change how we do things as a result of the pandemic. For today, I want to focus, as Hannah said, on how the pandemic has affected young people and how we're changing the way that we respond to their needs moving forward. The changes that I'm going to talk about today are informed by learning that we've gathered over the last 3 years from our schools project, Learning to Succeed. It was a project that focused, if you like, on areas where we have, you know, lots of indicators of poverty amongst our residents, and also where, if you like, educational poverty was a key driver. So 3 years ago, we started working with 30 schools across London in partnership with Construction Youth Trust. The objective was to focus on addressing skill shortages affecting the construction sector in the coming years. You know, we're a major house builder, and what we wanted to ensure through the programme is that we have a sufficiently qualified pool of workers in all areas. So the focus was very much on STEM subjects and developing work-ready skills. We were also very keen to sort of promote the idea across our business that if we're going to build homes, we need to ensure that there are people who can be economically active enough to buy those homes and remain in London to keep it, you know, the vibrant city that it is. So we're currently in the process of re-procuring the programme for a further 3 years. And as a result of what we've learned, I'm going to give you a very sort of quick snapshot of some of the things that we've learned from the young people who were engaged in the original programme. Encouragingly, almost 90% of the participants told us they feel more confident about their capacity to learn and prepare for exams. 75% told us that they feel equipped to make better informed decisions and, you know, are more confident about the continuation of their education career. On the less positive side, 65% of us told us that they were less confident about their future employment prospects because of the pandemic. Just under 50% said that they were less confident about accessing higher education. Many told us that they didn't think it would add that much value to their you know, career prospects moving forward. And surprisingly, because we were talking about young people here, 20% of them were worried about levels of student debt. And that was making them feel anxious about, you know, what the future may hold. Sort of finally, for now, we asked what would be the biggest influences on their career choices. Now, not surprisingly, a good proportion highlighted salary as the biggest driver, followed by promotion opportunities and the ability to develop a career in an organisation over a sort of long to medium term. You know, a lot of people were anxious about what they're seeing from their older siblings, you know, 0-hour contracts, short-term contracts, moving from one job to another with, you know, a high degree of regularity. And slightly surprisingly, 30% of them told us that they wanted to work for organisations that care about the environment. So the effect of Greta Thunberg may well account for the growing number of young people who express an interest in marine biology as a future career. As I say, that was a very quick snapshot of just one small project, and you know, thank you for listening.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, great to hear a bit about kind of the young people that are going to be the kind of future leaders of our city. We're going to have a bit of time for some questions now. Thanks to all the panel for their contributions. But I do want to leave time for networking as well, because I think these sort of topics benefit some smaller group discussions. If anybody has a real pressing question and they want to put up their virtual hand, please do. But I'm going to just go to a question first, which I think I'm going to pose to Chatinder, and to Laura as well. So Amy has asked in the chat, we've talked a lot about different kinds of diversity, I suppose, in some of the kind of groups that we want to better consider in our work, but we haven't really discussed class. And there is a feeling that there's a sort of blocker to progress because we're not understanding the experiences and needs of working class people, which is an area obviously a lot of us are working in. So Jatinder, any reflections on kind of what we can maybe do to overcome that, and then I'll come to you, Laura.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question, and it's a significant challenge, and I think it has been for a while. I think as an organisation, you know, we are very, very invested in the communities in which we work and serve, and I think what we've had a long-standing track record of doing is trying to understand and engage within those communities and provide the housing solution, or some to help with the broader solution. And there's been a lot of work in our organisation and across a number of peer organisations in a similar way in terms of trying to improve not just access to the appropriate housing, but access to education and work and employment, which a number of other panellists have discussed today. But it is probably a very difficult one to sort of have a magic bullet answer for. I think it's a matter of ensuring we understand our communities and making sure we continue to engage and have appropriate solutions.
Yeah, definitely. Laura, any further thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point and a really important question. For me, there's sort of two levels to this. One is on a short-term level, and I work in a culturally and basically on every level diverse community in Aldgate and Aldgate East. And in order to engage people, and we always talk about the wider community and the spectrum of the community, we use multiple different communication channels, and we also build capacity into our strategies to make sure that we can reach people who wouldn't necessarily normally engage. There's a real thing about dominant voices. We don't want to just engage the people who are used to engaging in these conversations. The other thing is that we often work with people on the ground, and one of the projects actually that I'm involved with at the moment is building a community steering group who would then help to co-produce the strategy. So if community members see themselves represented in a group, and people in the community steering group can then reach further into the communities. On a longer term strategy, I think there's a lot of distrust between communities and authorities, which obviously needs to be improved through many, many different means. And that's something that can help to engage the spectrum of the community. And then I think what's really vital is that everybody in the community, or people from different groups, see themselves in positions of decision making and power. And that sort of refers back to what people across this conversation have talked about, and what I've talked about as well, is that those decision making processes and power structures need to open up to allow people from all sections of the society and all classes to participate, and therefore more people will end up feeding into the processes.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Thanks, Laura. And I think there's just so much shared ambition. It's just what we now need to all think about is whether we're developers, housing associations, public sector, private sector, what's our role in that to make it happen. So I'm going to kind of draw this session to a close now so that we can have some of those conversations in smaller groups, which I think will be really fruitful. Thanks to our panel for such a brilliant discussion. I'm sure you'd like to all join me in thanking them. It's a really difficult brief to respond to this topic in a couple of minutes, but I think they've all done wonderfully, and already we can get a real idea of some of these shared things we need to focus on. I think putting the communities and individuals who could most serve to benefit from fairer cities has come through really strongly, and now it's about the how we do that. I think there's something about timing and thinking really tactically, because we've heard about this sort of windows of opportunity for things and ways things are changing. So how do we sort of take advantage of those for, you know, what does travel and working patterns offer to make things fairer, safer, and more affordable? And as ever, it's a Future of London catchphrase, but collaboration has come through really strongly. And I think, you know, really important for us to sort of make that extra effort while a lot of people are still working remotely and will continue to. So with that in mind, we're going to hopefully develop some collaboration with the networking sessions. Be really good to hear a bit more from all of you about some of these themes. And how we kind of take some of this forward. We're going to have 3 rooms, each with a topic and a host to guide discussion to kind of continue some of the stuff we've been talking about. Room 1 will be hosted by Anouk Khan, looking at diversity. Room 2 is going to be Jatinder, looking at affordability. And the final room will be with me, looking at what we focused on today. What do we need to how do we need to support our leaders, and what do our leaders need to do to make this stuff happen? It will be pretty informal, and if one room is kind of particularly unwieldy and oversubscribed, we may ask people to shuffle around. But yeah, please choose the one. You'll see the options shortly on your screen to be able to choose. Please choose whichever interests you most, and we hope that you can start to make those connections to try and address some of the things we've discussed today. We won't join back in this room at the end, so this is my opportunity really to just thank our sponsors again. So Arup, Countryside, Lewis Silkin, Montague Evans, Mount Anvil and Pollard Thomas Edwards. Please keep an eye on our website and our mailing list for future events in the programme. Thanks once again to our brilliant panel for their time. They must be exhausted, but hopefully not too exhausted to have a bit more of a chat with all of you. And also want to thank the Future of London team who are working in the background